My son called me on a Tuesday evening, and before I'd even finished saying hello, he said the sentence I'm still turning over in my mind months later. "Mom, listen about the wedding. Ashley and I talked, and we think it's actually going to be a really small, intimate thing. Immediate family only, close friends. You don't need to come. We just don't want you to feel like you have to make the trip." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone a little too tightly, looking out the window at the barn in the distance, the one on the old Miller property, the one Kevin and Ashley had announced 3 months earlier, with a photo and a caption that read, "We found our dream venue." And I said, very calmly, "That makes sense, sweetheart. Don't worry about me." I hung up the phone, walked to the hall closet, took out my coat, and drove 22 minutes to the bank. I hadn't opened my safe deposit box in almost 4 years. I still remembered the little brass key sitting exactly where I'd left it, in the small ceramic dish on my dresser, right next to Frank's reading glasses that I've never had the heart to give away. My name is Margaret. I'm 67 years old. I taught high school chemistry for 29 years, which means I have spent nearly 3 decades of my professional life teaching teenagers that every reaction has a cause, that nothing happens in isolation, that if you're patient enough and pay close enough attention, you can always trace an outcome backward to the exact moment it started. I want you to understand that about me, because this isn't a story about a woman who snapped over one phone call. It's a story about a woman who watched a slow reaction happening in her own family for over a year and finally decided to do something about the compound she'd been quietly holding back the entire time. I should tell you a bit about the house I still live in on Sycamore Street, because it matters to how this story unfolds. Robert and I bought it the year Kevin was born, on a shop teacher's salary and a chemistry teacher's salary combined, which even then wasn't much, but it was ours, paid off in full 11 years before he passed. We never had the kind of money the Whitfield Hastings family has always had: old money, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it's never had to. What we had instead was 31 years of careful saving, a modest but well-managed investment portfolio Robert insisted on setting up the year Kevin started kindergarten, and a trust we built together, quietly. The way people who grew up without much tend to build things. Patiently, and without telling anyone how far along the foundation actually was. My son Kevin is 31. His father, my husband Robert, passed 4 years ago, a stroke, sudden, no warning. The kind of death that leaves you standing in a hospital hallway trying to remember what you were supposed to be doing that afternoon before your entire life rearranged itself around a single terrible hour. Kevin was 27 then. We got closer in the years right after, the way grief sometimes does that to two people who love the same man. Then, about 2 years ago, Kevin met Ashley. I want to be careful here, the way I try to be careful with every reaction I run in front of a classroom, because I don't think Ashley is a villain exactly. I think she is a young woman from a family with a certain kind of comfort, the Whitfield Hastings family, if that name means anything to you, which it will, eventually, in this story. And I think she has spent her whole life in rooms where nobody had to ask twice for anything. I don't think she set out to erase me. I think it simply never occurred to her that erasing me was something she was doing. Here's how it happened, one small reaction at a time. The first sign came about 1.5 years ago, at Thanksgiving, the first one Ashley spent with our family. Somewhere between the turkey and the pie, Ashley's mother, Constance, leaned across the table and asked me, in the friendliest possible tone, what Robert had done, career-wise. I told her he'd been a high school shop teacher for 31 years, same district I'd taught in, and that we'd bought our house on Sycamore Street the year Kevin was born and never left it. Constance smiled, the particular smile of a woman recalibrating something in real time. "How lovely," she said. "Simple as nice." She turned back to her wine within about 4 seconds, and I understood, with the clean clarity of a chemistry teacher watching a reaction complete itself right in front of her, exactly what category I'd just been sorted into. The second sign came about 8 months ago, when Kevin and Ashley got engaged. I found out about it on Facebook, along with 400 other people, roughly 6 hours after it happened. Kevin called that evening to explain Ashley's father had wanted to be there for the proposal, he said, and things had moved fast, and he was sorry. He should have called first. I told him it was fine. It wasn't entirely fine, but I understood. The way you understand a lot of small things you decide not to make into a larger thing than they need to be. The third sign was the venue announcement. Kevin and Ashley posted a photo of a converted barn on a vineyard property 40 minutes outside of town. Genuinely beautiful. String lights and reclaimed wood and a view of rolling hills that looked like something out of a magazine. With the caption, "We found our dream venue." Underneath, in the comments, Constance had written, "So proud of you two for making this happen on your own. Real adults now." What none of them knew, what I have never once mentioned to anyone in this family, because it was never meant to be mentioned, because I did it quietly and on purpose, is that making this happen on their own had actually happened with the help of a $40,000 deposit I'd wired to the venue 6 weeks earlier, the week after Kevin had called me, voice tight with the particular stress of a young man trying to build a life he couldn't quite afford, to ask if I had any advice about how they might make the venue work within their budget. I didn't give him advice. I gave him the difference. Quietly. Through my financial advisor, using the trust Robert and I had set up years before he passed, the same trust that still, to this day, holds the deed to the barn property itself, because I hadn't merely covered a deposit. I had, 6 weeks before that Facebook post, purchased an option on the property outright, structured through the trust, specifically so that if anything ever fell through with financing on Kevin and Ashley's end, the venue itself would never be at risk. I did it the way I do everything important. On paper, properly, with my attorney present, and without telling a single soul. The fourth sign came 4 months ago, when the guest list started taking shape. I found out, through my sister Diane, who'd heard it from Constance at a bridal shower, that the small, intimate wedding Kevin had mentioned to me on the phone somehow included 140 guests, nearly all of them from Ashley's side. Business associates of her father's, sorority sisters, a small parade of Whitfield Hastings family friends I'd never met and never would. My side of the guest list, as it turned out, consisted of exactly 11 people. My sister. A few cousins. Kevin's 2 closest friends from high school. I wasn't on it. I found this out not from Kevin, but from an invitation that arrived at my sister Diane's house, a beautiful, thick cardstock invitation, engraved, clearly expensive, with my name conspicuously absent from anywhere on the guest list Diane had glimpsed on the venue's planning portal, which she'd been granted access to as a bridesmaid. The sixth sign, smaller than the others, but somehow the one that stung longest, involved my mother's engagement ring, the one Robert had reset for me on our 25th anniversary. The one I'd always planned to eventually pass to whichever of Kevin's future children showed the most interest in family history. At a bridal luncheon I wasn't invited to but heard about secondhand. Constance had apparently produced a ring of her own, a Whitfield Hastings heirloom, several generations old, considerably larger than anything I owned, and presented it to Ashley as the ring that belongs in this family now. Ashley wore it instead of the modest solitaire Kevin had originally proposed with, a ring I later learned he'd quietly returned to the jeweler, embarrassed, once he'd seen the alternative sitting in a velvet box at Ashley's parents' house. Nobody asked whether I might have wanted to offer something of my own for that moment. It simply hadn't occurred to anyone that our family had heirlooms worth considering, because our family, in this particular story, had quietly stopped being considered a source of anything except modest, sentimental gestures, the kind you're grateful for, perhaps, but never actually build a wedding around. The seventh sign, the one that finally made all 6 previous signs click into a single, undeniable shape, was the phone call I told you about at the very beginning of this story. We think it's actually going to be a really small, intimate thing. You don't need to come. Small and intimate, apparently, meaning 140 of Ashley's people and 11 of mine, held on a piece of land my late husband's trust technically still had an ownership stake in, that I had quietly funded so my son wouldn't have to admit, To a family that had never once had to worry about money, that he couldn't otherwise afford the wedding his fiancée wanted. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for a long time after that phone call, key to the safe deposit box still in my coat pocket, engine off, hands folded in my lap the way they used to fold when I was waiting for a difficult lab result to finish developing. I thought about 29 years of teaching chemistry, of explaining, year after year, to rooms full of restless 16-year-olds, that every reaction needs an activation energy, some initial push that gets things moving, before the rest of the process can unfold on its own. I had been quietly supplying activation energy to my son's entire adult life, a down payment on his first apartment, a loan for his car that I never once mentioned had been forgiven the day he married, and now this, the largest and most consequential push of all, and I had done all of it invisibly, because I didn't want him to feel indebted. And because some old-fashioned part of me believed that quiet generosity was somehow more honorable than generosity anyone actually saw. There's a difference between giving someone a foundation and letting them build a house on it and then tell you there's no room for you inside. I decided, right there in that parking lot, that I would not cause a scene. I would not call Kevin back and cry, or argue, or beg for an invitation to a wedding I had, in every meaningful financial sense, already paid for. I decided instead that I would simply make sure that when the truth eventually surfaced, and truths like this one always surface, eventually, the way every reaction I ever taught eventually reaches completion, it would surface on paper, cleanly. Undeniably, exactly the way I'd structured it from the beginning. I got out of the car and walked into the bank. I had 6 weeks before the wedding. I used every one of them. Move 1 that Tuesday at the bank. I opened my safe deposit box for the first time in 4 years. Inside, exactly where I'd left them, were the original trust documents Robert and I had drawn up together, the deed showing the trust's ownership stake in the vineyard property, and the wire transfer confirmation from 6 weeks before Kevin and Ashley's engagement, the $40,000 transaction that had made their dream venue financially possible in the first place. I photographed every page with my phone, then had the bank make certified copies of the originals, which I left safely back in the box, because I am not a woman who destroys her own paperwork out of spite. Move 2 that Wednesday. I drove out to the vineyard property itself, alone, and walked the grounds one more time before it became, in every practical sense, someone else's memory instead of mine. I stood under the same string lights that would be lit for the ceremony in 6 weeks, and I let myself feel, fully and without apology, exactly how much it hurt to know I had quietly made this beautiful place possible for my son and would, according to his own phone call, not be welcome to stand in it on the one day it would matter most. Move 3 that Thursday. I called my attorney, Harold, who had drawn up the trust with Robert and me 11 years earlier and who still, as it happened, served as trustee alongside me. I explained the situation. Harold, who has known Kevin since he was a boy and has always had a soft spot for him, was quiet for a moment on the phone and then said something I've thought about often since. "Margaret, you don't have to do anything dramatic here. The paperwork already says what it says. You just have to decide whether you want anyone else to see it." I told him I did. I asked him to prepare a formal letter, nothing threatening, nothing punitive, simply a factual summary of the trust's ownership interest in the property, along with the original wire transfer records, ready to be shared if, and when I decided the moment was right. Move 4 the following week. I did something I hadn't originally planned, which was to call Constance directly. Not Kevin. Not Ashley. Constance, mother to mother, over coffee at a place halfway between our two towns. I told her, calmly and without accusation, that I understood the wedding had grown larger than originally planned, and that I understood guest lists sometimes had to be difficult, and that I simply wanted her to know, before the day arrived, exactly how the venue had actually come to be available to them in the first place. I showed her, on my phone, the wire transfer. I watched her face do something complicated, surprise, certainly, but also, underneath it, a flicker of the same recalibration I'd watched her do at that Thanksgiving table 18 months earlier. Except this time the math was running in the opposite direction. Kevin never mentioned this, she said slowly. I didn't ask him to, I said. I've never wanted credit for it. I only want you to understand that this family, my family, has contributed rather more to this wedding than an 11-person guest list would suggest. Constance was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer. I think I owe you an apology I don't fully know how to give yet, she finally said. I made assumptions about your family that I never actually checked. That's an ugly thing to realize about yourself over coffee. Move 5, the week of the rehearsal dinner. I asked Harold to have the letter ready, along with the certified copies, in a plain envelope, in case I needed it. I didn't know yet whether I would. Some reactions, I've learned, complete themselves without any further intervention at all. Once the right catalyst has already been introduced. The rehearsal dinner was held, fittingly, in the same barn. String lights already strung for the following day's ceremony, long farm tables set with white linen, 40 or so guests gathered for the smaller pre-wedding event. I hadn't been invited to this either, technically, but Diane had quietly forwarded me the details weeks earlier just in case, and I decided that afternoon, sitting in my car outside the venue, that some reactions do, occasionally, benefit from a witness. I walked in during the toasts. Kevin was mid-sentence, glass raised, thanking Ashley's parents for making all of this possible, when he spotted me standing near the entrance. His face went through several distinct stages: confusion, then alarm, then something closer to dread, the particular dread of a young man who has just realized his mother is standing in a room he specifically told her she didn't need to be in. Mom, he said, setting down his glass. We talked about this. You did, I agreed, walking further into the room, aware of 40 pairs of eyes now watching a conversation nobody else had context for. You told me it would be a small, intimate wedding. I wanted to come see the venue one more time before it belonged to someone else's memories instead of mine. Constance, seated near the head table, went very still. She, at least, understood exactly what I meant. What does that mean? Ashley asked, looking between her mother and me with the dawning unease of someone realizing a conversation is happening that she isn't fully part of. It means, I said, keeping my voice as even and unhurried as I would have used explaining a chemical equation to a classroom of teenagers, that 6 weeks before you two got engaged, I purchased a controlling option on this property through my late husband's trust, because Kevin called me, worried he couldn't afford the venue you both wanted. I've never asked for credit for it. I've never mentioned it to anyone outside this family, until I mentioned it to your mother a few weeks ago over coffee. The room had gone very quiet. Somewhere near the back, I heard someone's fork click softly against a plate and then go still. Kevin's face had drained of color. Mom, why didn't you just tell me? Because I wanted you to have this without feeling like it came with strings, I said. And it never did come with strings, Kevin. Not once, in 6 weeks, did I ever intend to use it as leverage. I only opened that box again because you called me on a Tuesday and told me I didn't need to come to my own son's wedding, held on land I quietly made sure would still be here for you no matter what happened with your own financing. That felt, to me, like something worth clarifying. Ashley's father, Richard, who had been quiet throughout, finally spoke, addressing his daughter rather than me. Ashley, did you know about any of this? No, Ashley said, very softly, looking at Kevin now instead of me. I had no idea. Neither did I, Kevin said. Mom, I swear, I had no idea you actually bought part of the property. I thought the deposit was I thought it was a gift, not this. It was a gift, I said. I never intended it to be anything else. I'm not here to take the venue away from you, or to embarrass anyone, or to ruin a rehearsal dinner. I'm here because 11 people from my entire life were invited to watch my only son get married, and I was told, quite directly, that I wasn't needed at all on a piece of land that, legally, still has my name attached to it. I think that's worth at least one honest conversation, even if it's an uncomfortable one, at exactly this moment. I noticed, then, the ring on Ashley's finger, the Whitfield Hastings heirloom, catching the string lights as she twisted it nervously, and something in me, some old ache I hadn't fully examined until that exact second, finally found its way into words. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll go, because I don't want to make this evening about me any longer than it already has become. I looked at Ashley directly. My mother's ring sat in a box at my house for months, while your family's ring took its place on your hand, and nobody thought to ask whether our family might have had something worth offering too. I'm not angry about the ring, exactly. But it's part of the same pattern, and I think it's worth naming out loud, just once, before tomorrow. Ashley's eyes filled. Nobody told me there was another ring, she said. I would have wanted to see it. I would have wanted to know. Constance, still standing beside me, closed her eyes briefly, the particular expression of a woman doing rapid, uncomfortable math about her own choices over the past year. That ring was my mother's idea, not mine, she said quietly. I should have asked more questions about whose family we were building this wedding around. I didn't raise my voice at any point during that dinner. I want to be honest about that, because I know stories like this one often end with someone storming out, or a wine glass shattering against a wall, or a mother making a scene loud enough to be remembered for a generation. That's not what happened. That's not who I am, and it isn't the lesson I want Kevin to carry into his own marriage, however this particular evening ended up unfolding. I simply set down my purse, looked at my son, and said the thing I had been rehearsing, in one form or another, for 6 weeks. Kevin, I love you, and I am not here to punish you or take anything away from tomorrow. The venue is still yours to use. I've already instructed my attorney to formally transfer my remaining interest in the property to you and Ashley as a wedding gift, effective tomorrow morning, no strings, no conditions. I decided that weeks ago, before I ever opened that safe deposit box again. But I do need you to understand something, and I need Ashley and her family to understand it too. I am not a line item that gets quietly funded and then quietly excluded. If I'm generous enough to be trusted with the foundation, I expect to be trusted with a seat at the table built on top of it. Constance, to her credit, stood up at that point, walked over, and did something I hadn't expected. She took my hand. Margaret, I am so sorry. I think I let myself believe a story about this family that was never actually true, because it was simpler than the real one. That's on me, not just Kevin and Ashley. Ashley, still pale, nodded slowly. Can we fix the guest list? Even now, even this late? That's between you and your florist and your caterer, I said, gently. I'm not asking you to rearrange your wedding overnight. I'm only asking that going forward, in this family, quiet generosity doesn't get treated as an excuse for quiet erasure. Kevin came around the table and hugged me, the first real hug we'd shared in longer than either of us probably wanted to admit. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, voice rough. I got so caught up trying to make everyone else happy that I stopped noticing I was leaving you out of the one thing you'd actually made possible. I held on to him a moment longer than I might have otherwise, the way you do when you realize a conversation you'd braced yourself to survive has instead turned into something closer to repair. Over his shoulder, I watched Ashley quietly excuse herself from the table and disappear toward the parking lot, phone already in hand, and I found out later, from Diane, that she'd spent the next 20 minutes on the phone with the venue coordinator and her wedding planner, rearranging seating charts and place cards well past midnight, moving my name onto the family table where, in every meaningful sense, it had always belonged. I want to tell you how the story actually ended, because I think it matters more than the rehearsal dinner did. I was seated, the following afternoon, in the second row, directly behind Kevin's side of the family, at a wedding that had, in the span of about 18 hours, quietly rearranged itself. Diane sat beside me, wearing a corsage that hadn't existed the night before, one Ashley had apparently ordered at 10 o'clock at night from a florist willing to make an exception. Ashley, walking down an aisle strung with the same lights I'd once helped pay for without anyone knowing, caught my eye halfway through the ceremony and gave me a small, genuine smile, not performative, not for show. Just an actual moment of two women finally seeing each other clearly. I noticed, too, that she was wearing both rings that day, the Whitfield Hastings heirloom on her right hand, and, on her left, a slim, unfamiliar band I didn't recognize until the reception. When she found me at my table and quietly explained that she'd asked Kevin that morning to have my mother's ring reset into a second band, small and simple, worn alongside the other one rather than instead of it. I wanted both families in this marriage, she said. Not just the one that's loud about being there. At the reception, Kevin gave a toast. He thanked his father's memory, briefly, the way he always does at moments like this, and then he said something I hadn't expected, something that made the whole room go quiet in a different way than the rehearsal dinner had. I want to thank my mother, he said, raising his glass toward the second row. Not just for being here today, though that means more to me than I think I managed to say before now. But for something most of you don't know, and that I only found out myself a few weeks ago, this entire venue exists for us today because of a decision she made quietly, months before Ashley and I were even engaged, expecting absolutely nothing in return. I think that's actually the best description of my mother I've ever managed to put into words. She gives you the foundation and never once asks you to notice. I cried a little at that, the good kind of crying, the kind you don't try very hard to stop. The safe deposit box is empty again now, mostly. I moved the trust paperwork to my attorney's office a few weeks after the wedding, once everything had been formally transferred the way I'd promised. But I keep the little brass key in the same ceramic dish on my dresser, next to Robert's reading glasses, because I think I'll always want it close, even with nothing left inside worth protecting. Here's what I learned at 67 years old, after 29 years of teaching teenagers about cause and effect. You can give generously and quietly your whole life and still deserve to be seen. Love that has to stay invisible to be accepted was never really love being honored at all. It was just being used.